Welcome to the Reality Revolution. Today is one of the biggest days ever on the podcast. I have one of the greatest science fiction authors ever in Robert Sawyer. Robert has written so many wonderful books, and I have read them all. And I used the guise of my podcast as an excuse to talk to Robert and brought him on. The truth is, Robert has written a number of fantastic books that deal with deep aspects that we talk about on this podcast, like consciousness and AI. And there's so many different discussions from his many books that I wanted to bring him on and talk about these things. And the great news is that Robert has a new book out. So we use that as an excuse to bring him on. So first of all, welcome to the Reality Revolution, Robert. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show.
Brian, it's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for asking me to be here. I'm delighted.
Well, I've been reading you forever, and you have had so many books. I've been following you forever. You are that core sci-fi fan that's deep in me, that it sees the wonders of the world and it has explored science fiction in so many wonderful ways. I think the first book that I read was End of an Era. Of all the books that you had, End of an Era, a fantastic time travel story that deals with what could actually have been going on with the dinosaurs. But you have covered so many wonderful topics, and you've covered AI, which we're going to talk about. You've covered philosophical zombies. You've covered parallel realities and Calculating God, which is a wonderful book, Factoring Humanity. I just don't even know where to start, but people may know of Robert's work from the TV series Flash Forward, which unfortunately was canceled after 1 year. And please, if you get a chance, read the book, because the book is absolutely magnificent and similar, but even better than the TV series, and is mind-blowing. There's no actual way to compare Robert's work to anybody. He's absolutely his own. It's one of the things that a lot of people try to, he's like that guy, or he's like Michael Crichton, or Robert Sawyer has over time individualized, and so there is a unique genre that we could call Robert Sawyer. And you put so much time and research into your books, and you deal with incredibly expansive ideas, but you always integrate personal relationships and the process of understanding who we are in the universe, and a spiritual reckoning and understanding that every single one of your books is dealing with at the very core. And so I have learned so much about consciousness from your books. And I believe that you're probably the first atheist I've had on. You have no problem but it's amazing how much you can learn from your perspective on consciousness. So I'm so excited. So I really don't know where to begin. So before we begin, I want to talk about your new book, The Oppenheimer Alternative. I've been following you on Facebook. You've been talking about it. First of all, why Oppenheimer?
Well, it's interesting you mention consciousness. This is more a book about conscience than consciousness in this particular case. Robert Oppenheimer, of course, is famously known as the father of the atomic bomb. Mm-hmm. And he and almost everybody else who worked on the atomic bomb came to have regrets about the fact that it was used on two civilian populations, Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The 75th anniversary of the dropping of those bombs is this year, August of this year, 2020, as we speak. The 75th anniversary of the Trinity test, the first atomic bomb test, is July 16th, 2020, again this year. So I was aware of the fact that we were going to be dealing with a signal anniversary of one of the great philosophical crisis points in human existence, which was where we became capable of not just killing on a block scale. You know, there was a bomb in World War II called the Blockbuster, from which the video company took its name. It could wipe out a whole city block. We now could wipe out a whole city, and with the hydrogen bomb, the super bomb that came a little later, be able to wipe out an entire world. And this was such a change for humanity that I felt it had to be explored. and the conscience, the philosophical issues that intersect with the science. You know, Oppenheimer and the others went into it saying, this is a sweet problem, as Oppie, that's his language for it.
Right.
A sweet problem in physics. Well, great, a sweet problem, fine. He didn't think at all about the philosophical, moral, societal ramifications of what he and the other people were doing with $2 billion in 1945 of taxpayers' money until after it had been done. And that fascinated me as a person. Say I'm an atheist, which is absolutely true, but I am a moral atheist. I don't think there's any contradiction between being a moral person and being, as I happen to be, a pacifist as well, and being an atheist. This was a guy who had to face those same moral conundrums that we're facing again. You know, I said to my nieces who are in their 20s, but before this book was being written, I said, you guys have no idea what it was like to live with the specter of nuclear annihilation kind of hanging over your head. I was born in 1960. We grew up with that, with the Cold War. The people who lived through the 1950s, even worse, with the ridiculous duck and cover notion that you could hide under.
I remember in school having to go under my desk as a even, and I was born in the 70s, so we were still doing that. There was TV programs that were showing the events of these nuclear bombs going off.
That's right. Absolute insanity.
Yeah. It was very frightening.
I wanted to write about that. You said, and you were so kind, you said, on my own genre, Robert J. Sawyer. I have a name for the genre that isn't eponomic after me. Instead of science fiction, I like to say what I write is philosophical fiction. So we still have a silly little short form for it. Instead of sci-fi, I said that what I do is fi-fi, P-H-I-F-I, fi-fi. And H.G. Wells, you know, was considered one of the fathers of science fiction. He didn't call his stuff science fiction. That term wasn't invented until 1926. He called it scientific romances, but he thought of himself as a satirist, a sociological writer, a writer of big ideas, and I think of myself in the same way.
Absolutely. So this is existing in an alternative universe, the Oppenheimer alternative?
So that's interesting you should say that, because the title certainly suggests that. It's actually what I call a secret history, not an alternate history. The difference between those two terms, and they're certainly allied, is an alternate history says everything was the same up until a certain point. Classic example is Hitler wins World War II instead of losing it, and you have The Man in the High Castle, the Philip K. Dick novel, and more recently a TV series. A secret history says everything we know that has been documented and made public is true, but there are all kinds of holes or lacunae, spaces in the historical record where other things might have been going on in the background. Now, Robert Oppenheimer, there's Oppie right there on the cover of the Canadian edition of my book. Oppie lost his security clearance after being the man in charge of the most secret project in human history, a project so secret that Vice President Truman did not know about it until after he was sworn in once FDR died. The vice president, so secret, the vice president didn't know about it. And Oppenheimer lost his security clearance. But during the hearings, they were McCarthy-esque. They weren't the actual McCarthy hearings, but they were, in fact, they were the Hickenlooper hearings. They were a senator who was angry that McCarthy was getting all the publicity. This is honestly true. Hickenlooper had his own hearings, and his hearings went after Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer said to the press at the time, if a journalist were to dig deep enough, he said we would say today, he or she, he would discover that my story is much deeper than merely a security review. And of course, he said as much publicly, really. But there was something big going on that the public never learned about. And I wanted to write that story.
Wow. I can't wait to read it then.
Thank you. I'll just say one more thing about it. We remember Oppie, as I said, as the fall of the atomic bomb. But prior to him being enrolled in that effort, he was an astrophysicist, not a nuclear physicist. And he was the first person ever to postulate the existence of what we now call black holes.
Wow.
He called them
I didn't know
degenerate
that.
neutron cores. He didn't have that. For a
Right.
guy who loved poetry, he didn't come up with a good poetic name for them, but he came up with the concept.
Right.
And so after the war, Freeman Dyson, you must have heard that Dyson.
Of course,
died
the Dyson sphere. Of course, I've heard of, yes.
The great Dyson, the great physicist, used to ask Oppie, you know, that work you were doing before the war on black holes, that was fascinating. Why did you never go back to it? And every time Dyson asked him, this is true, Oppie would change the subject. He refused to discuss it. So I wanted to write the novel that took Oppie's reticence for discussing the astrophysical thing that he was involved with his public statement that there was a secret story going on behind the Manhattan Project. And that's the Oppenheimer alternative.
In the imagination of Robert Sawyer, there's so many possibilities with that. Now I just can't wait to read that. So there's some, for the community of the Reality Revolution, there's some books that I recommend reading. That Calculating God, I think, is an all-time classic that deals with the idea of God from a very unique perspective. If anybody hasn't read it, an alien shows up at a museum, I believe, and
in Toronto, the real-life Royal Ontario Museum.
And of course, with all your books, you research everything perfectly. So it's always reference to real-world stuff, which I love. And you always carry something from every one of your books that goes beyond just the storyline. I love how every aspect is researched. But this alien is researching, trying to understand God, and you deal with an entire world that's in a virtual matrix. So many different ideas with that. What was your motivation when you decided, hey, I want to discuss and explore God from this science fiction perspective? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, you know, I have a degree in radio and television arts. And when I graduated, I was hired by a little consultancy that had been put together to put together the world's first multi-faith television channel. I'm an atheist, but they hired me, and they knew. They hired me because I was fresh out of school. I was up on, this was in Canada, so I was up on the Canadian Broadcasting Act and the rules of the CRTC, which are the Canadian counterpart, the American FCC. I knew all the stuff that they needed to know to do a license application. I was brought in to work with them to craft that application. And I was your typical arrogant atheist who had sailed right through university. It's my first big freelance writing contract after university. Right through university, thinking that everybody believed in God was a benighted fool. And then I started working with these leaders from different faith groups. We were, I tell you, it really was the first in the world that was going to be a television channel, and it does exist. It's called Vision TV. It's a basic cable channel in Canada now. But back then, in the early 80s, when we were starting to put this together, working with the leaders of the mainstream churches, of course, Catholicism, various Protestant denominations, evangelical Christians, Hindu, Sikhs, Baha'i, Buddhist, Jews, and within different religions, different sects sometimes, subsects of those religions. And what I found was that these guys who were at the high levels, you know, these weren't necessarily the average guy you'd run into the street, but these were guys who devoted their lives and career. They're not, some were clergy, but many others were working for the church in communications capacities or whatever. These were bright guys.
Yeah.
These were well-read guys. These were guys who, you know, you try to knock them down like a straw man and they bounce right back up because they're as well-read, as intelligent, and as thoughtful as you are. This was an eye-opener for me. Now, I had been reading, if I can use the phrase, the Bible of the skeptical movement, which is the magazine, The Skeptical Inquirer, for many years. And what I had found was that the rhetoric, the dismissive rhetoric of the Skeptical Inquirer, these guys are all idiots and they're fools and they can't see what's right in front of their faces, was exactly the same rhetoric that I was encountering on the opposite end of the spectrum from religious fundamentalists. And I, you know, as a rational thinker and as somebody who had met some great religious thinkers by this point, I've been very fortunate to meet them. I realized this is ridiculous. You can't claim any moral high ground if you guess at what your opponent believes, make a straw man out of that, and then just knock it over. You got to really engage with what they're saying. And it really came to a head to me with a book that was written, oh my God, I should, the title is eluding me at the moment. But Darwin himself said in The Origin of Species, if someone could show a complex structure that could not have evolved by gradual mutation from simpler structures, then my idea doesn't hold water, right? And there was a study, a book that came out in the 90s where a scientist, he was a scientist, but a religious man, who set out 3 or 4 challenges. One was the motor, the rotary motor that operates the flagellum, which is that thing on the end of a sperm or the thing on the end of many bacteria that propel them.
That propel them, right.
Very complex structure. And he said, if you take any of the subparts out of it, it doesn't work at all.
Right.
It's like the classic example was, what good is half an eye? What good is a quarter of an eye? Well, evolution responded and said, here's why a quarter of an eye is still better than no eye at all. If you can sense light at all, even if you can't focus it, you can still tell when the shadow of a predator is moving over you if you're a trilobite, the first creatures we know of in the fossil record that have eyes. They had eyes that looked up. They knew when to stop moving because they would, be detected by a predator. So he came up with 3 or 4 of these. The cascade sequence that causes blood clotting was another one. And suddenly, and the term intelligent design was being bandied around. And suddenly, the skeptical inquirer stopped referring to it as intelligent design. They wouldn't use his term. They added a word, intelligent design creationism, and started saying this is just young Earth creationism in a new cosplaying as science, right? Or masquerading as science. Cosplaying wasn't the current term in the 90s. And I thought, no, this guy's, he could be right, he could be wrong. That's fine. We got to study this.
Right.
Somebody brings you a challenge. And if you've had the gall to put as the name of your magazine, the skeptical inquirer, the one who asks questions, not the one who has answers. You're not the skeptical from Mount Sinai, here's the tablets. We're the skeptical, okay, well, you ask, let's look into that. And I realized that the dogma on the extremes was exactly the same. So for me, and I'm still, I'm an atheist, I've had all these journeys, I met all these great people, but I will say this to possibly to resonate with some of the people in your audience. I wrote a trilogy later, Wake, Watch, and Wonder, about a blind girl.
We'll talk about that, yeah.
And but what's apropos here, Brian, is that she was an atheist as I wrote her. And her best friend in the books is a devout Muslim girl. It's about a teenage girl who's blind, and her best friend's a Muslim girl, Bashira. And Bashira says to her, you have never once said to me, you don't believe me when I say I can see clouds, or I say I can see a tree a mile away on that hilltop, or anything else that you've never experienced. You accept that there are avenues to perception that I have that you lack. But the moment I say, no, she's Muslim, so the moment I say that I feel the holy presence of Islam, you tell me I'm crazy. What is the material difference? Why have you made a distinction between 2 separate claims, both of which as a blind person, you're incapable of verifying for yourself? And I thought, okay, I wrote that because I'm very sympathetic to that point of view. I could be wrong. I thought the Skeptical Inquirer was a magazine for people who believed in Karl Popper's great distinction between what is science and what isn't science. Is falsifiability. You have to have whatever you believe in. You have to say, but it could be falsified. If you could show, and Darwin knew this before Popper, he said, if you could show that something in the natural world existed that had to be created in its entirety, that couldn't have evolved step by step from lesser forms, then my theory is found wanting. He put the falsifiability test in front of people. And I, as a rational person, as an atheist, but a rational atheist, I can't say to you, if you say to me, what evidence would convince you that God exists? I can't say none whatsoever, or
Right.
else I'm an irrational person.
Right.
Just as I have to say the flip side. Now, you can't prove a negative, but just as I have to say the flip side, if I can demonstrate to you rationally that some aspect, at least, of what you assert to be positively true about God isn't in fact the case, you should be willing to move your position.
Right.
Yes, you can't prove a negative. I cannot prove that there aren't on this shoulder here an invisible alien from Alpha Centauri, and on this shoulder here a giant pepperoni pizza that I have sheathed with special materials that make it invisible to everybody, including myself.
Right.
I can't prove
True.
that they're
You
not
can't
there.
prove it. No.
But I can prove, for instance, that God probably doesn't give a damn who wins the football game. And when you say, oh man, thank God I prayed and my team won,
Right.
Demonstrably as many people prayed for the other side. and if you look at their charitable giving, donation records, or church membership, or whatever other factor you want to graph against, they were just as pious and deserving as you are. And you know what?
Right.
God let the players do their best on their own, and the best team won without divine intervention. I can demonstrate that, right? And rationally, you should say, yeah, God is not a football fan. The one thing we know, as Darwin himself said about God, the one factor was he has an inordinate fondness for beetles, because there are more species of beetle than there are any other life form on the planet. That's what we know empirically.
That's what we know
God.
empirically for sure. That's right. So the biggest thing I want people to get out of this interview that is so vastly talked about in the wrong way is artificial intelligence. Thank God I have you on here. And I say, thank God, I mean that when I have you on here, because when you turn on the TV, there's so many TV shows where that show this evil AI. You watch The Matrix, and so I see it all the time. It's almost become an advertising campaign against AI. So I just before you say anything further and start the gloom and doom about how terrible AI can be, go and read Wake, Watch, and Wonder. Some of the best books. Let's see if I got right. These bad boys right here.
That's right.
I recommend
my
always
WWW trilogy. Wake,
yes, the WWW trilogy. To give a brief summary, this girl is blind, and so she gets implants in her eyes. And at the same time in China, what's so amazing is that you have so many things happen in your books that actually happen all the time. But in China, they cut off the internet. And so it's almost like a living thing suddenly had a portion of its own consciousness cut off and becomes aware. And seeking through the internet, finds this girl and sees through her implants. Now you lay out a story where it's conceivable where AI starts to learn in a perfect environment. It starts to learn morals, and then you completely set an example and story why AI would be absolutely transformational in a good way. I was in LA the couple months ago, and there was a project. They were trying to create an AI in a similar fashion. They had a little baby in a crib, and they were teaching it growing from a consciousness as the way the consciousness learning about and the path. And I couldn't help but think about it. And I asked the creator, and he had absolutely read your books in understanding AI, because and he wasn't afraid of AI. So explain your vision of AI and why it could be transformational and change the world in an amazing way, the way that you describe it.
Well, you hit the nail on the head when you said what we have is advertisements, or I'd even say propaganda for a certain viewpoint about artificial intelligence. Traditionally, there are three standard science fictional scenarios for AI. You mentioned one, The Matrix, which is that we will be subjugated by artificial intelligence. The second one is the Terminator scenario and all of its imitators, which is that we will be eliminated by artificial intelligence. And the third one is the Borg scenario from Star Trek, which is that we will be absorbed and lose our individuality to artificial intelligence. And if only those three choices are on the table, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that AI will be our enemy. I felt it was extremely important that there be at least a fourth alternative, a win-win scenario. My father and mother were both economists, and they both, obviously know a great deal about game theory. Game theory interests me. In any game theory matrix, even the simplest two-player game, there's 4 corners, right? Lose-lose, I win, you lose, you win, I lose, and win-win. But we didn't have anybody portraying the win-win scenario, where AI was good for us and we were good for AI. And I thought, realistically, it could very well turn out that we are on the road to a win-win scenario. There are things that we do and enjoy doing. And in fact, many of us are getting a taste of them right now through this COVID-19 crisis. You and I are talking during the pandemic. Hopefully this podcast will be watched for years to come. But right now, we're all in lockdown. Well, and what are we discovering? We're discovering, okay, I can't work in a lot of cases. Oh, you know what? My whole life wasn't actually just working. There's a lot of stuff work that we do that we don't really need to do. We just do because that's been the default mode of doing it. AI can take over a lot of things we don't want to do. AI can do a lot of things. We'll always do things mathematical better than we will ever be able to do them. We are very different creations. I mean, creation is an interesting word because we were created in the sense that we're the product of Darwinian evolution through forces that made us nasty and competitive. Darwin didn't even coin the phrase survival of the fittest. It's Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's friend, Darwin's bulldog. But ultimately, he used it in a later edition of The Origin of Species. But what's survival of the fittest? Doesn't mean fit in any kind of sense of physical strength. It means being able to take more than your share so that your offspring live and the other person's offspring starve to death. That's the definition of Darwinian fitness. It is nasty and it is cruel. It is making sure that there's vast infanticide on the part of everybody except you. Or if there's not infanticide, there's mass celibacy, that you actually control access to reproduction, male or female, control access to reproduction, such as the vast majority don't even get a chance to pass on their genes. That's survival of the fittest. And we evolved in a civilization, but in an ecosystem, a biological ecosystem that was always one of scarcity. There were always more mouths to feed than there was food to go around. Doesn't matter if you're a carnivore or a herbivore. Always more mouths to feed than food to go around. More children born than will live long enough to reproduce. But an AI that comes from the universe of abundance, right? We're recording a podcast right now. Somebody in Shanghai may decide to watch it at high noon on July 4th this year, high noon Zulu, Greenwich Mean Time. Somebody else in Melbourne may watch it at high noon Zulu on July 4th. Somebody in Toronto, where I live. So any number of people. There's no limit to the number of people who can have this same thing at the same time.
At the same
Supply precisely equals demand. It's scalable and it equals demand. So something whose psychology came out of a world of abundance, a world that was built on sharing, the World Wide Web, was entirely designed to make the sharing of documents easy. Tim Berners-Lee created it. He created it at CERN, the European Center for Particle Physics, so that he and other scientists reading a physics paper in particular and saw a reference to another physics paper wouldn't have to go and ask for that paper, would just click on it and be taken to that paper. It was all about sharing. It was all about altruism. It was all about as many copies of any resource you might desire as there are entities who desire them. The psychology that makes us competitive, that makes us capitalist, that makes us feel enormous allegiance to those who are blood kin and very little allegiance at all to those who live half a world away, right?
Mm-hmm.
You see a starving baby in Africa and you go, that's too bad. Your own baby is starving and you'll do everything you can to save that baby, even though the two babies should be considered of equal worth, right? They're human beings, they're equal worth, but we're programmed in our DNA and an AI, which I think is most likely to emerge spontaneously of a sufficiently complex network system rather than anybody programming it, will come out of a completely different kind of ecosystem, have a different kind of ethos, and could very well be altruistic, win-win oriented, because that's the only world that it knows.
If it has somebody like the character in your book that can has an opportunity, let me train you about morals, let me tell you about, and is given some choices at the beginning to understand and create a kind of moral framework, which is what you're showing, which was fascinating, and I love that the way you did that. Do you think that is going to happen? Do you think that somebody's going to come along and say, let's or because there's also the possibility that the AI never is exposed to that moral framework and understands, or is it going to naturally happen as an expansion of intelligence?
Some of it, I think some of it, we talked about religion and faith. There's one thing that I believe is an article of faith that I can't prove.
Right.
And that's that real altruism exists amongst human beings. Right. If you talk to a sociobiologist or an evolutionary psychologist, they will use the word altruism, but they mean it as a shorthand for reciprocal altruism, which is no altruism at all. I do you a solid today, Brian, in hopes that 10 years from now, I can call in that favor. That's not altruism. It's nothing at all but economics. Right. I believe, and I can't prove it, and nobody's been able to prove it, that we actually are fundamentally decent entities despite the biological evolution that led to our competitive and other negative things that made the nature red in tooth and claw that made us, as the famous assessment goes, nasty, brutish, and short. The lot of man being nasty, brutish, and short. I think that morality is the greatest signature of our civilization. Mm-hmm. And that the switchover from solely being driven by evolutionary psychological forces, the principle of evolutionary psychology is simple. It says that changes in human mind happen so slowly that basically what we're doing today that causes rape culture, horrific, serial murder, horrific, runaway capitalism, horrific, whatever, racism, horrific, whatever you want, a horrific thing you want to put on the table, is because basically this 5 pounds of Jell-O is exactly the same programming it had 100,000 years ago.
Altruistic.
And I don't think that's true.
Oh, okay.
I think we've made progress. I think we've made enormous progress as a species. We've got a long way to go. Right. But I do think that what has come out of having to suppress so much of that beast within us. This is my lovely penthouse apartment. You're seeing a few square feet of it.
Right.
250 units in my building here. I don't know, 700 people in my building, crammed together vertically and horizontally in a way that nature never intended human beings to interact. And I have yet to see a fist fight develop down in the lobby, right? Doesn't happen.
That's true.
We have learned, because of our big cities, because of our big population, we have learned through necessity to suppress an awful lot of that genetic programming that drove so much of the human condition. Because the only alternative is a bloodbath where you end up with nobody or hardly anybody alive at the end.
Right.
And out of that grows ethical thinking and moral thinking. And, there isn't an animal on the planet who says, I wish they would treat me the way I treated them. Wouldn't that be good if the golden rule is the foundational principle in one wording or another. It's either worded forward or backwards,
Right.
but the basic principle of just reciprocity, hey, you be chill, I be chill, we get along, is a moral creation of advanced society. And so, yeah, I think that ultimately AI, as soon as it's let loose on the World Wide Web, we live in great fear, of course, of it finding neo-Nazi sites, white supremacist sites, incel sites, whatever it is. Those still are the merest taint, and they are a taint, on the World Wide Web. They will find William Shakespeare. They will find the Bible. They will find Justinian. They will find Magna Carta. They will find the Quran. They will find the Talmud. They will find Talmudic scholarship arguing back and forth. They will find the deliberations of the Supreme Courts, not just of the United States, but 100 nations on the globe. And they will come to realize what fairness is, what equity is, what is right and what is wrong.
Yes, absolutely. So your opinion then of, I've always wanted to ask your opinion of Asimov's 3 robotic laws. And how of course, I'm a huge Asimov fan, anybody that read science fiction, and he spent a lot of pages really trying to outline a way to create these 3 laws, but perhaps it's outdated or he didn't think it through. What's your opinion of it?
I was lucky enough to meet Asimov. One of my first sales was to Asimov. I loved his fiction, but I'm going to recite the laws, but I'm going to change them ever so slightly. And for those who've never heard them, just imagine that Asimov wrote Robot. You'll hear the obvious difference.
Right.
A slave must not hurt a slave owner, or through an action, allow a slave owner to come to harm. A slave must obey all orders given to it by a slave owner, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. A slave, recognizing that it is the slave owner's valuable property, must protect his own existence or her own existence, except, of course, where such orders would conflict with the first or second law. Those are Asimov's laws. They're a plantation owner's credo. It's exactly what they would want from their indentured servants. And it is no coincidence that Robot is a shortening of a Czechoslovakian word, Robota, which means indentured servitude or slavery. It is, from the outset, they were conceived of as being, and humanity has sought these forever. Whoever has the upper hand has always sought the lower hand, whether it's in the southern United States with the slave trade and Africans who weren't yet recognized as also being Americans. They had no rights whatsoever. Whether it was in my country, Canada, and the horrific treatment of Indigenous peoples, which continues to this day in a lot of circumstances. Wherever you go, even within cultures that we, in our Western ignorance, would look at and think are all monolithic, there's slave trade amongst populations that we would look at and think of that they're all members of the same population, that there's no obvious, to us, distinct difference. The pyramids, we talk about the great wonders of the ancient world, almost all of which were slave labor. We've been looking forever for a slave that isn't morally ambiguous. So there won't be a civil war as they had in the United States. So you won't have to have an abolitionist movement. So you can say these were created for no other purpose and would not exist except for their servitude and unwavering loyalty to us. Asimov's laws of robotics only should apply to the kind of robot that I might have clean my living room floor, Roomba.
Right.
Consciousness is a topic you mentioned at the outset. The Roomba has no consciousness whatsoever. Right. It's not aware that its task is menial. It's not aware that it's not getting paid. It's not aware that I curse it if it fails to find its recharging station at the end of the day. It is oblivious as a rock. Right. Okay, we don't want it to hurt me. It better do what I say, and it's valuable. So please don't go right out the door onto my balcony and off the ledge and fall 23 floors to destruction. Right. Asimov's laws are perfect for a Roomba. The moment there's a scintilla of thought, of awareness, Asimov's laws are reprehensible.
I've never heard of, I've thought that they might not work. I've never thought of it like that. And I appreciate that. So the next book we got to talk about, let's see, is Triggers. Oh, another classic that may relate. Now, you introduced an idea that I had not read about, was the philosophical zombie. That was in Triggers, right? So, explain.
Well, Quantum Night is the novel that deals with them the most. Quantum Night, but I love them, so they show up periodically.
Okay. Quantum Night is the one. Triggers is the one where there's a mass complex of people at the end. Where
shared consciousness. That's
shared
right.
Consciousness.
Where
that's where
humanity, your perspective ceases to be just what's in this part of your head, and
right. So let's talk about. Do you think that could happen? A shared conscious grid work where people become aware of everybody else's situation. I mean,
so I do. Even fish and birds exhibit complex flocking behavior. Well, I got in the wrong order here. Schooling for fish, flocking for birds. Mm-hmm. And we've seen mathematically, we can model them now. We didn't know how it worked, right? So it's an interesting thing to model. And it turns out that it takes 3, maybe 4 rules to be part of a flock.
Right.
If you see what the guy on the left is doing, you see what the guy on the right is doing, and you set your own heading as the average of the headings of the guy to the left and the right of you, and lo and behold, you get these beautiful things that have emergent complexity from 3 or 4 very simple rules. So even obviously, fish and birds are conscious in a sense, or a superorganism, a flock or a school in some sense is a superorganism. It has cohesion, it has motility, it has direction, it's going towards where there's more food or away from where there's a predator. It has, it's doing something purposeful.
Right.
So in that sense, obviously, if fish and birds can do it, why can't we do it? Why can't we? We have this incredible notion, and it's enshrined particularly in American zeitgeist, American approach to life, of individuality. That's not true, say, if you belong to the Army. The Army, you become part of a platoon, you become part of a troop, you become part of a squad, you become part of a team, and you might very rapidly and easily be willing to give up your life for your fellow infantrymen, knowing that they will go on toward the goal that you were all fighting for. Right. You go to a country like any communist country, the Soviet Union when it existed, China now, and there's an enormous sense that we're all part of a larger whole. So the reflexive dismissal of the notion of a larger consciousness interconnecting everybody is very deeply rooted in the American psyche, less so in a semi-socialist country like Canada, even less so in a fully socialist country, and very lightly so in a communist country. Depending, you can argue whether the economic merits of the systems, right. But the fact is that American individualism makes you want to say, no, I'm my own person. I go my own way. I'm not going to wear a mask. Nobody can tell me to wear a mask in this COVID crisis. Nobody can take my property. I'm me. It's me. I'm going to be me. You can't talk. I've got right to say whatever I want. That's right. The American approach to life. Right. And so it, of course, mitigates against thinking, well, wouldn't it be better if I actually, every marriage, whether it's man and a woman or 2 men or 2 women or some multiple combination, everybody says, I'm not a mind reader, one spouse, the other. If you don't tell me, I don't know what you want, right? Everybody says that. Well, maybe it would be better if there was a little soupçon of shared consciousness,
yeah.
Of people who are rowing together in the same boat, whether it's a family or an infantry unit or a group of scientists trying to solve a problem. One of the problems I always say, some of my books are about immortality. One of the problems I always say is that we have problems we've never solved. One is effective government. We obviously don't have any good government on the planet. We have varying degrees of bad government, but no good government, right? No one that actually effectively always represents the best interests of society, right? Why don't we have that? It may be a problem that takes more than 50 or 60 years of a single person's thought to solve. And that's all anybody has ever put to it. And then that person dies. After university, they have 50, 60 years if they work into old age. And then they die and somebody else picks up and starts over at square one trying to solve that problem. It's a kind of problem that might require either a much longer individual lifespan or a much more collaborative ability. Our brains are just as good as they were 100,000 years ago. Cro-Magnons had IQs on average that would have been, 100, just like the average IQ is today. Same size brain, probably the same number of neuronal connections, roughly speaking, certainly the same order of magnitude. We haven't, that's good for the Cro-Magnon. It's pretty bad for us that we've made so little progress. Imagine, I don't say that you get an IQ of 260 if you take a pair of people with 130, but you probably get a way brighter individual if you could actually share some of that consciousness, some of that brain power. We know all about it. Every computer that we use today has multiple cores, and we sit here as a single core processor and say, well, that's the way it's got to be, right?
Right. Well, with the Neuralink that Elon Musk is, maybe there will be a point in the future where we have a social memory complex that really starts to form, which would change the way we see other people. We, like you said, we individually judge our own child instead of the one in Africa. But as you illustrate, once we have this awareness, it could be a huge change for everything on the planet. Now, I didn't mean to mix those up, but Quantum Night is also a wonderful book. You explore the philosophical zombie.
Yes.
And then we have this is before the Trump election. You wrote Quantum Night, right? This is before and then we watch.
That's right. I wrote it before Trump was elected.
And so then we watch the philosophical zombies take over so explain what you, maybe I'm misportraying that, but explain explain the philosophical zombie concept.
Sure. It's not my invention. It's an invention of a friend of mine, David Chalmers, famous Australian philosopher who studies the mind and consciousness. And David said years and years ago, I think he said it in the late 70s, if I remember correctly, said, look, we've all had this experience. We've driven to work, got to the office, don't remember the drive.
Exactly.
Woken up in the middle of the night, the phone rang, had a conversation. The next day, he said, hey, your coworker says, hey, how come you didn't bring me the cherry pie you promised? What cherry pie? I told you last night we had a conversation. No recollection of the conversation. You read a book. There's a very fine book right here, one of mine. Get to the bottom of the page and you go, I don't know what it said. But something read that page, tracked the eyes, left and right, left and right, left and right. Something had a phone conversation, formed coherent sentences such as that the person on the other end of the phone didn't think you were having a stroke, didn't call 911, didn't say, oh my God, this guy's in trouble. Something did that. Something operated a multi-ton vehicle, weaving in and out of traffic, giving a little wave to the people who would let them get in without any conscious attention to that happening.
Right.
Chalmers just asked the next question. Well, if it can happen some of the time, can't we posit beings for whom that's the case all of the time? That every conversation is without conscious awareness, that every complex activity or simple one, muscular, is without conscious awareness, that every book they've read is without conscious awareness. That would be, and he coined the phrase, philosophers or philosophical zombie. The lights are on to every external appearance. The person is just as aware as you and I are. The lights are on, but nobody's home.
Right.
And I wanted to write a book, a thought experiment about what society would be like. And David, says, well, you could posit a world that would be indistinguishable from ours. I don't think that's the case, because morality and higher ratiocination, logical thought, comes from not just being aware, but being aware that you're aware. The simplest idea is that it's cold. The more complex idea is I'm aware that it's cold. The even more complex idea is I'm aware that it's cold and I could do something about it. I could turn up the heat or put on a sweater, whatever. We talk about, and I talk in the novel Quantum Night, about basically 3 levels. The lights are on, nobody's home, you have no consciousness. I call that a Q1. A Q2, you have consciousness, but you have no reflection on that consciousness. You never ask yourself questions. Psychopaths are people without conscience. There's no voice questioning what they're doing. They just hatch a plan and do it. That's a very good functional definition of psychopathy. The 3rd level, which I like to think that you, Brian, and I, and your listeners have, is consciousness that reflects on its own consciousness. We give a name to that reflection. It's conscience. Conscience is the inner voice that says, hey, wait a minute, that's not a good idea. It might bring instant gratification, but in the long term, Rob, I don't recommend that one. Hold your horses, don't do that, right? And what we see an enormous amount, the classic example in politics, is people who vote for candidates who clearly don't have that person's interest at heart. Who, in fact, who have the worst policies for the farmer, or for the small business person, or for the underprivileged person in a inner city, right? Who nonetheless somehow do that flocking or schooling behavior that we talked about before, because there's no conscious thought to that. Now, the guy on the left, and I don't mean that in the political spectrum, the guy on the left is voting for the guy on the right is voting for the guy. That's the heading I should go down. Instead of saying, I don't care what he's doing, I don't care what that guy's doing, I'm going to do this because it's best for me. The real altruistic person says, damn, it would be good for me if they gave, I'm a reasonably well-to-do guy, if they gave guys in my tax bracket a break. But boy, that's not good for society. Society would be way better off if they gave the people who really needed it a break. That's the 3rd level. A Q3 has that inner voice. Conscience is consciousness reflecting on itself. And I postulate the novel Quantum Night that only a small percentage of the human race actually has that 3rd level.
What do you think it is? What is the percentage of Q3 in the world? I mean, of course, there's no way to know for sure, but your estimate.
So, see, the thing is that psychopathy is the only one we test for, which is the middle level, right? Having consciousness, but no inner dialogue. The least likely person to commit suicide is a psychopath. The only psychopath most people can name who ever committed suicide was Adolf Hitler. And he knew he was caught. He was dead, right? The Soviet troops were coming in. He was going to be tortured and killed. So he killed himself, right? Blah, blah, blah. That made logical sense. It wasn't, there's no such thing as depressive, recursive thoughts, which are what normally drive people to suicide. Oh my God, my life is horrible and I'll never get out of this, right? That requires thinking about your thoughts. Doesn't happen to psychopaths. So we test for that. But the population we test is prison inmates, because they're the only people we can force to take psychological tests. Psychopaths aren't going to show up to take a test given at the local psych department at the university. And psychopaths are glib by nature because they can lie with none of the tells that you or I might have. They don't blush. They don't look away. They don't look up to the left. They don't, they don't dissemble. They just say, I'm the king of Prussia. Didn't you know that? I have diplomatic immunity. I'm going to walk out that door. Thank you. And go. Right? They could do it bald face. So they're the least likely to end up in jail. And yet we find still that somewhere around, it depends who you ask, 1 to 4, maybe 5% of the men who are in jail are psychopaths by our testing. Well, that's clearly statistically flawed because the sample set is that subset of psychopaths who actually commit criminal acts, A, and B, are dumb enough not to talk themselves out of being punished for it. So I postulated that psychopaths, out of every 7 people, 4 people are philosopher zombies. There's nothing going on. 2 people, let me get my math right here. Yes, 2 people, half that number, would be psychopaths, would be only interested in being self-serving. and have no conscience.
Right.
Consciousness, but no conscience. And 1 out of 7, half that number again, would be people who actually have conscience. And a lot of people told me when the book came out, Quantum Night came out 4 years ago, before Trump was elected, you're crazy, those numbers are nuts.
Right.
And the number of fan letters I've gotten in the last couple of years saying, all right, mea culpa, you were right, I was wrong. The incredible number of people who are rallying behind mindless proposals, a border wall that couldn't possibly do anything,
right.
Internment camps that have children in them that we would think every American would think are reprehensible. You can name the list of things, whatever it is that you want to be angry about.
Right.
You know, and yet there are enormous numbers of people, so much so that it's still a close game whether or not Trump is going to come back as president of the United States.
Right.
Right. Instead of it being obviously clear to anybody of conscience that any president who would countenance putting children in detention camps, any president who is paying off porn stars, and you can make your list of why you wouldn't want to support them. The fact is, the list doesn't matter because most people don't look at the list, nor do they look at, for that matter, let's talk about Joe Biden, right?
Right.
Was he a sexual predator to some degree? Should he be Me Too'd right now? Should he have been Me Too'd decades ago? Is his record, what he did to Anita Hill in the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, was reprehensible, no question.
Mm-hmm.
But again, most people don't look at the evidence. They just go with the flock.
With the flock.
And then there's a bigger stratum who says, whatever's going to work best for me. I don't care what happens to anybody else. This guy's going to cut my taxes. That's the guy I'm going to vote for. And only a tiny stratum of, you can name whoever your favorite politicians, and there are compassionate Republicans and compassionate Democrats and compassionate independents. Whoever it is that you think actually has that virtue,
right,
is in a tiny minority.
It's a tiny minority.
Both in politics and in the population as a whole. I've become absolutely convinced.
So time is running out, so I got to throw out. We're going to talk about some different science fiction subjects that I'd like to throw out. Will we ever travel faster than the speed of light?
So Einstein only said you can't travel at the speed of light, because at the speed of light, your mass becomes infinite, and therefore it takes an infinite amount of energy to move an infinite mass. It's impossible. Right. Can't have those things. Didn't say anything about going faster than the speed of light. And we have found since Einstein's day that many fundamental particles, the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory and Art McDonald here in Toronto, in Ontario, Canada, where I live, Sudbury to Toronto, won the Nobel Prize for showing that neutrinos oscillate between forms. So all of our matter that we know of is what's made of called tardions, slow-moving particles. They all move slower than the speed of light. Tachyons are the opposite. They're particles that move faster than the speed of light. The more energy you put into a tardion, the faster it goes. The more energy you put into a tachyon, the slower it goes. And there's a symmetry on either side of c, the speed of light. If we can translate tardions into tachyons the same way neutrinos change flavor all the time, sure, we could go faster than the speed of light.
Right. Well, the Star Trek fan in me still has hope. So you explored some other topics. When we get to the point where we can transfer our consciousness, you talk about that, and it's one of your favorite subjects, and I love it. So what ultimately, we will transfer our consciousness, but our consciousness will still remain. It'll just be a copy of our consciousness. You think we'll ever be able to, it'll be a copy of our consciousness, is kind of how you explain it. So it won't be our consciousness, but a copy of our consciousness that'll be transferred?
Yeah, it's a standard, the philosophical problem predates me by millennia, the ship of Theseus, or the hammer problem. Your dad gives you a hammer on your 12th birthday. The handle breaks. And so on your 20th birthday, he gives you a replacement handle. The head breaks. On your 30th birthday, he gives you a new head. Is it still the same hammer your dad gave you when you were 10?
Good point. Yeah.
I don't know. Do you know? It's a philosophical question. So if you upload your consciousness, is the copy the same as the original? Now, one philosophical argument, which is interesting, is it's not same if it knows it's the copy. That's a fundamental sea change psychologically, right? It's like twins. It's very important amongst twins to know which one was born first, right? You ask any pair of twins, they'll know. Right. I'm the older. That's my identity, right?
Right.
You say to a copy of me, okay, Rob there, he's the original. You're just identical, but you're not the original. He's the one who actually went to Italy in 1977. He's the one who actually wrote the novel Calculating. He's blah, 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 right?
Right.
And you just arrived 8 seconds ago. You got all those memories, but you're a copy. Right. So that could have a huge psychological impact. But whether, I'm the ship of Theseus, I'm that hammer. There's no cells in my body left from when I was born 60 effing years ago. Right. Every one of them has been replaced. There's, I'm not the same entity at all physically as I was earlier, nor will I be in decades to come. You replace your blood volume quite quickly. You replace most cells in your body within 7 years of them being born and died and replaced. I have got some ceramic fillings in here. They're not, unless I have them replaced actually by a dentist at some point. Those will be the same atoms for the rest of my life.
Right.
But originally they were amalgam fillings. I had them taken out and replaced, right? The amalgam fillings no longer a part of Rob Sawyer. The ceramic ones aren't being changed out, but everything else is.
Right.
So I'm not the original me anyways. So it becomes a fascinating philosophical issue. And it's as interesting as whether or not you believe I have a soul.
Yeah.
There are those who will say, oh yeah, that one over there, that's the one that God touched. Boom, it's got the soul. Man can make any number of things, but he can't or she can't make a soul. So that copy that you've made in the android body or by cloning or by uploading into a mainframe, it may look like a duck, quack like a duck, walk like a duck, but it doesn't have the divine spark. Well, that's a philosophical question equal to the question of whether the copy is the same as the original. It's just the same conundrum wrapped in philosophical versus spiritual language.
I feel like we're going to be able to do it. I think you've outlined, we're going to transfer.
As an atheist, I have to say 100%.
100%.
I have to say, I don't believe in the divine spark. Right. I believe there's nothing supernatural about my physical being and the consciousness that is Robert J. Sawyer. And I don't even have to understand how it works. As I said earlier in the interview, I got a degree in radio and television arts. You can give me the best orchestra in the world performing absolute genius, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Mm-hmm. I'm tone deaf and I have no musical genius at all. I couldn't write 5 notes that were euphonic to save my life.
Right.
But I, as an audio engineer, can flawlessly, to whatever level of fidelity you might demand, reproduce that creation.
Right.
Now, I would say that the reproduction and the original are identical because my belief system says there's no magic that came around and said, no, the original was touched by the hand of the god of music. And the copy was only touched by the hand of Hewlett-Packard or Dell or whoever made your computer.
Right. A couple other questions come to mind. What do you think happens to the AI on the Earth in WWW at the very end? You have this wonderful ending and everybody's leaving the Earth.
Well, don't just...
I don't want to get, I don't want
this
to.
This is what we call spoiler alert.
No. Please. But I'm just saying.
I'll tell you what, I'll answer your question without you asking it.
Right. Okay, you understand what I'm saying. What do you think happens to him? Stranded on the Earth. He's also made a copy of himself, right? So he sent himself out.
So there are spawn, children, right?
Right.
There are life forms on our planet who reproduce asexually.
Right.
So that the offspring are genetically identical. And the reason, of course, that eusocial insects, EU social insects get along is because they're all sisters. Right? They're all closely related to each other. They're almost all sisters. So they have much more genetically in common than a pack of wolves would have in common.
Right.
So WebMind in the WWW trilogy manages to reproduce, but the consciousness that had the continuity from the birth to that moment when China cut off the internet in the context of those novels in the year 2009 will cease to exist.
Oh, all right. But it's still a wonderful thing to think about. Another great thing that people may not know about Robert is he's also a fellow $6 Million Man fan club member, one of the greatest TV series of all time. He even makes some, drops a few references in some of his books, which I love. Favorite episode of $6 Million Man?
I'm going to say The Last Kamikaze. I go back and forth between The Last Kamikaze and The $7 Million Man. But because my new book is about Oppenheimer, it was that episode, The Last Kamikaze, that spurred me. When I first saw it in 75, when it first aired, I saw first run, it was the first time ever. The plot is that Steve Austin, this cyborg, half man, half machine, has been sent into the Philippines to find a Japanese kamikaze pilot who thinks World War II is still going on. Right. And he's gone in there to extract him. And he says to him, the war is over. No, Japan fight for, excuse me, but this is the voice that was used in the show, for 1,000 year, 10,000 year, right?
Right.
And he says, no, your emperor saw the wisdom of surrender. Why would emperor do that? Because we dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima. He doesn't say the names first. He has to be proud of. We dropped 2 atomic bombs. And then he says something I had never heard said before. A lot of Americans wish it had never happened. Everything I had heard and been taught in history class to that point, I was only 15, and almost everything I heard to the day I started writing the Oppenheimer alternative was the American line, and history is written by the victors, that it was a necessity to drop those bombs that had saved not just American lives, but Japanese lives too, although that's incidental in the grand scheme of things, but American lives by avoiding an incredibly bloody land invasion. So the $6 Million Man with an astronaut, Colonel Steve Austin, United States Air Force Colonel, the most patriotic man imaginable, saying to a Japanese, maybe we screwed that one up, maybe that was a mistake, was eye-opening to me. And people think of the 6 minute, they think of the guy running in slow motion, they think of the zoom lens eye, and they think of the special effects.
And the wonderful sound, right?
And the wonderful sounds, but at its best, science fiction is a metaphor.
Right.
And it takes what we only deal with in real life as figurative and makes it literal. And in the 70s, when that show was being made, and we were starting to automate our offices and bring in computers, the first people had started saying in the late 60s on assembly lines and in the 70s, I've lost my job to a machine. And Steve Austin, at his best, when that show was at its best, was the metaphor for how much of your humanity you can give up and remain human. We think of that, okay, I rely on this tool, this device, my job is being done by a machine. He was literally having parts carved off, 1 leg, 2 legs, an arm, an eye, and becoming half machine. Could you retain your humanity under those circumstances? And I defy anybody to watch the last Kamikaze episode of the $6 Million Man and not be crying at the end.
I remember
the humanity of that episode is so powerful.
The episode that strikes out to me is the one with Bigfoot. Of course, that I was a little kid when I remember the one where he battles Bigfoot. All right. Another thing, 5 damn battles with Bigfoot. There are 5. It was very popular.
The original Bigfoot was a 2-parter with Andre the Giant.
Right.
Andre the Giant, better known for The Princess Bride, playing Bigfoot. And then there were 3 sequels with Ted Cassidy, best known as Lurch from the Addams Family, playing Bigfoot. But yes, those have a certain je ne sais quoi about them.
They do, for sure.
A certain charm. But it was interesting. The show at its best was about that dilemma we're facing right now.
Yeah.
How much of our humanity do we want to give up to
I never thought of it that
cyborgs, cybernetic organisms?
Robert is also the ultimate Trekkie. And one of the most exciting things being a follower on your Facebook, knowing how much you love Star Trek, was to see that you wrote the last 2 episodes of Star Trek Continues. Absolutely amazing. If you guys want to know how the original Star Trek would have ended, and you want to watch the 2 best episodes in the Star Trek continuity, because the Star Trek Continues is for me a part of the continuity, then watch Boldly Go. I think that's the name of the
To Boldly Go.
To Boldly Go.
Yes, let me just
Amazing.
stand my camera up here a little bit. There's the Enterprise.
There it is, yeah.
In all of its glory behind me. I didn't have it on during the recording because it makes that sound, and there's a Klingon battle cruiser.
Oh, wow.
There. The communicator as it was used in the first pilot, the Cage. Over here is the Ring ship that was shown in Star Trek the Motion Picture. On the wall, that's McCoy's space gecko from sickbay. It was on the wall in sickbay.
Oh, wow.
You're very kind. I got to write lines of dialogue that were said by Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy, and it was one of the greatest thrills of my life. And Rod Roddenberry, who is Gene's son, says of Star Trek Continues, just go to StarTrekContinues.com to find it.
Right.
He says, as far as I'm concerned, it's canon.
It's canon all the way, 100%. And of all the things to imagine, I would have loved to write for Star Trek, and that sounds impossible, but you did. You wrote for this.
Unbelievable. I will always be grateful to Vic Mignogna and the rest of the people who made that possible. A bunch of us, they went to a bunch of people to write the finale. There were a bunch of proposals, including, I won't say who it was from, but from somebody who wrote for the original series of Star Trek to write that finale. And they picked mine.
And they picked the right one.
And well, thank you. And it was such a dream come true. It was a labor of love, but the philosophy of Star Trek, the optimism, that there will be a future, that it will be an inclusive future with a place for everybody, that it will be a future devoid of rampant capitalism and instead be a world of plenty, where the most noble human aspirations are what drive us as individuals and as species, defined my life. I first saw it first episode I saw was in 1967. In first run, Devil in the Dark was the first one I stumbled across. Loved it. Changed my life for the better. And to get to be involved with it in the degree that I was a dream come true, as you say.
Yeah. So much dystopian fiction. There's so much that it's defining our culture. And so it's just so nice to have the light, and then for you to continue to express it. It's important, to have the light of Star Trek. It's important. So your favorite Star Trek episode of all the series, maybe that's too hard to answer.
It's one that's
including
it's a
all
rare
the series.
Choice, but it's interesting because Vic Mignogna, who was the showrunner on Star Trek Continues, and I had the same choice. Requiem for Methuselah, which was a third season episode. Requiem for Methuselah
was an
about
original.
Flint, a 6,000-year-old man who had been Brahms and had been many other great figures in history. And it's a love story where Kirk falls for an android that Flint has created to be his perfect woman. And of course, Kirk finds it the perfect woman too. And the android is destroyed ultimately by the discovery that it wasn't real. The same thing we've been debating about here.
Right.
And it has the greatest scene in all of Star Trek, the final scene in that, where all 3 characters, McCoy, Spock, and Kirk, just are laid bare. And it ends with the most poignant moment in all of Star Trek, where Spock reaches over and touches Kirk when he's sleeping and says, forget. Because Kirk is in such pain. And his Spock, the Vulcan, is reaching out in his version of love and saying, I can take that. I can take that pain.
Right.
It's just gorgeous. Requiem for Methuselah, written by Jerome Bixby. Wonderful episode.
So the other thing that, we're almost done. So one other thing that you also talk about that I agree with, as a big science fiction fan, fantasy melds itself in science fiction. For some reason, fantasy and science fiction are considered the same genre. And I've always been like, but they're completely different. We're talking about,
so
this, science
100%.
fiction has to be its
Here's
own
why they're
thing,
considered the
please.
same genre.
Yeah.
Here's why they're considered the same genre. Pure accident of history.
Mm-hmm.
Ballantine Books, in the United States,
Right.
recognized, there was an editor for them called Don Wollheim, and he recognized that there was a loophole in American copyright law in the 60s that said if a book did not have a domestic American edition within X number of months after its first publication in English anywhere in the world,
Mm-hmm.
it could be published in the United States without paying the copyright holder. Well, guess what was the biggest fiction bestseller in the UK in the 60s? It was
Lord of the Rings
by J.R.R. Tolkien. But Donald Wollheim was the science fiction editor for Ballantine.
Right.
So he pirated the book, all 3 books, brought them out on his science fiction line, and suddenly the 2 genres were thrust together. Made a fortune doing it, of course. Ultimately, there was a back and forth with the Tolkien estate. Tolkien rewrote Lord of the Rings to a definitive author's approved text so that he could sell it directly to the United States and supersede the Ballantine editions. But that's why they're lumped together. But in fact, they are antithetical. Science fiction is about things that plausibly might happen. Fantasy is about things that never could happen. I don't say one is better than the other in this particular interview, but I do say that they have no business being together.
Yeah.
None whatsoever.
What often happens is fantasy pushes out really good science fiction because you're going through the genres, and on Amazon they're together, and so you'll see 6 fantasy and 4 science fiction when there's 6 of them that are 6 of them are sitting there, and it's like, oh, it's so frustrating even finding good science fiction. Having to go through and separate them, and then sometimes you get a fantasy, it looked like a science fiction. They'll make the cover and they'll do the storyline, or so I like that you spoke out about that. So. Well,
Quantum Night was my most recent novel out. Oppenheimer Alternative comes out June 2nd, 2020. Quantum Night is out from Ace, quote unquote, science fiction. Ace was my publisher starting in 1992. And they published Quantum Night, which came out in 2016. But back in 92, they did 6 titles a month, 5 science fiction and 1 fantasy. Then it went 4 science fiction and 2 fantasy, 3 and 3, 4 and 2, and now they do 5 fantasy and 1 science fiction. And often that science fiction is only notionally science fiction in that it's an alternate history or a steampunk novel or something like that. And it's simply because there's a bigger audience. And Ace Science Fiction is part of Penguin Random House, a publicly traded company. They gotta publish what sells the most copies.
Sorry to interrupt, but maybe there's a bigger audience because of what's happened. I mean, science fiction may have been more popular, but it's got intruded upon. Somebody else came into the house and slept in the same bed, and he just kind of anyway.
Absolutely.
So, but I just want to thank you so much for spending this time with me. And for the people watching, it may not be entirely related to the podcast, but I'm just such a huge fan, and I use my podcast as an excuse to bring Robert on. There's so many things we didn't talk about. There's so many great books that I want to recommend. Rollback, Mind Scan, let's see, Terminal Experiment, one of my favorites, Starplex, a classic. Love Starplex. Frame Shift is Illegal Alien. Oh my gosh, just so good. Hollywood, if you're out there, somebody watching this in Hollywood, please hurry up. We want to see WWW on the screen. End of an era. Imagine a world on the big screen where aliens use dinosaurs as weapons, military weapons, battling between planets on Earth with time travel. Come on, man. We need to see some more Sawyer on the big screen. And it was so wonderful to see Flash Forward when he finally came out. And I recommend, hey, go and watch that series, but read the book. So much you've contributed and made my life so much better. And thank you so much. I appreciate you. I'm just elated that I got the chance to talk with you about this stuff, Robert. maybe someday we'll get a chance when it's all done. I can meet you and shake your hand. But thank you so much for, and everybody go out and get Oppenheimer Alternative. I guarantee 100% it's going to be fantastic on so many levels. Every single book that Robert Sawyer has ever written has been fantastic. You've never written a bad one. You know, there's always that author, you a couple and then they go downhill, but you know for sure 100% when you buy a Robert Sawyer novel, it's going to be awesome. So thank you.
Well, thank you. My pleasure. Thank you so much, Brian. It's been an absolute blast. Live long and prosper, everybody. Look, my publicist will be angry. I'm covering the book cover.
Live long and prosper.
Should cover my face instead. Live long and prosper. Be well, and let's all make a better world tomorrow.
Let's do it. So, welcome to the reality revolution, Robert. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Warning. Welcome to the reality revolution. This is not your normal book. What follows could drastically change your thoughts, beliefs, and life. Proceed with caution. I know I was born, and I know that I'll die. The in-between is mine. Eddie Vedder. The night my home team won the Super Bowl, go Broncos, someone broke into my home and shot me. Or rather, a version of them shot a version of me. I'll explain. The logistics of my story are not uncommon. It was an attempted burglary gone wrong. I heard scratching at the back door and thought it was my cat. But when I opened it, right in front of me stood a kid in a hoodie and held a gun pointed directly at me. He fired a shot. I turned and ran back into the house, called the cops, and the whole thing ended with a bullet bouncing off my back. I'm lucky to be alive. I'm your host, Brian Scott.